Half-Life, the first-person shooter game released in 1998 for the PC, is one of the most instrumental games in constructing the notion of the modern game. It could be, in a sense, referred to as the first modern game. It came out during a pivotal time in gaming, where the abstract, surreal, mechanics-based gaming of games before transitioned into the realism, experience-driven games that we now consider to be modern gaming. Half-Life certainly isn't going to be the only example of games at the time doing what Half-Life did, but I do feel like it's one of the most fascinating examples, in part because it very rarely feels like a transitional game. Rather than being stuck between two eras, awkwardly trying to fumble its way into an exciting modern experience, it instead feels very much like it speaks the language of modern games, even though it still carries some dead weight from the old school. I want to discuss the design of Half-Life in depth in order to trace its lineage in previous games and genres, and then also discuss how these things and more coalesce into a powerful gaming experience unlike any games before it, and much more in line with many games to come. One of the most famous things about Half-Life is the opening tram ride, and for good reason. This was the first time in a major first-person shooter where you didn't start off with a weapon. This might seem like a minor detail in retrospect, but this is vital to the transition into the modern era of gaming. Immediately, the game establishes the tone of the game as preferring a degree of realism over arcade sensibilities, and tells the player, this is going to be an experience. This opening tram ride, while perhaps a bit boring from a gameplay perspective, gets so many things right all at once that from a design perspective it's honestly quite incredible. One of Half-Life's most prioritized goals as a game is to lift elements from cinema. Of course, now we take games behaving like movies for granted, because when someone thinks cinematic experience, they think of an influence on gaming that has become increasingly mundane. It's worth noting, then, that Half-Life's cinematic qualities were a starting point for a style of game development that, at the time, was vital to the development of gaming as a medium, and has become stale in more recent years. What makes this tram ride so interesting to me, however, is how it functionally serves a few different purposes. It sets the tone immediately as being more focused on the experience than on the action necessarily. It sets the game up as being more story-based than previous shooters. It also sets a cinematic tone, allowing for this intro to serve as a sort of opening credits sequence that the player is allowed to interact with. It also establishes the setting, allowing us to soak in all that Black Mesa is, so that we can really understand all that Black Mesa will become, making the cataclysmic event that much more explosive. The idea of an interactive credit sequence seems almost pointless, but I think that this is very important to the experience of the game overall. It takes the cinematic quality and disguises it as the gaming quality in such a way that it becomes one. The game's opening is interactive in a limited sense. You are literally on a rail, watching the world of the game unfold itself while you are free to look, but not necessarily move in any direction you please. This gives you time to become acquainted with the controls in a safe environment. It allows you a chance to experience the world around you without necessarily taking notice that this is, predominantly, just the credits sequence and establishing the scenario that the player is walking in on. And it uses a limited degree of interactivity to take something that would otherwise be mechanically a movie concept and transform that concept into something that is mechanically a gaming concept. Alternatively, they could have the game just have opening credits with no interactivity at all, or they could establish the setting by having a camera fly around showing you the world of the game before letting you take control. This is what Mario 64 did, where in that game, the plot and setting are first established with no interactivity. By giving you the illusion that you have control in this early section of the game, Half-Life somewhat subtly reminds the player that this isn't just a game, it's an experience. To me, the main thing that distinguishes the old school of gaming from what we would call a modern game is the way in which genre operates. In the past, different genres would develop different design trends separately, with sometimes no overlap at all. For example, if you wanted to play a first-person shooter in the 90s, you were likely going to be met with a game that focused extensively on the shooting alone, such that the game would have a bare-bones plot, if any. By contrast, if you wanted to play an RPG, you would get a game mostly about story and character interaction, and much less about the mechanical experience. The same can be said of many trends in many genres back before the beginning of the 21st century. A modern game, to me, is classified in how it blends differing genres, or at least varying design trends between them, into one coherent experience that is not simply a collage of gimmicks. I believe this is very true of Half-Life, that it blends design decisions from a myriad of genres, and I also think it does so in a way that people almost won't even notice some of the influences it seems to pull from. For example, in the early part of the game actually resembles an adventure game or an RPG more than someone might give it credit for. You begin the main portion of the game without a weapon, walking around the facility of Black Mesa, speaking to coworkers and messing around with the environment playfully. This reminds me immediately of RPGs and adventure games, where you had the freedom to interact with NPCs, many of whom would have some sort of canned response when you interacted with them. Unlike action games, which emphasize action so much that they immediately drop you into the action, the opening of Half-Life prioritizes the world of the game. This is not only an idea lifted from RPGs and adventure games, but also an idea that helped mix with the first-person perspective to emphasize realism to a degree that hadn't really been attempted by many other games at the time. This may sound a bit odd, but during the opening, especially when I made it inside the test chamber, on my most recent playthrough, I thought of the game Myst. Myst was a revolutionary game when it came to how environments were portrayed in gaming. Indeed, Myst was a game that told a story through its environment, where the setting was almost a character of its own. Myst also was designed, like many adventure games, to be based around a coherent world rather than a series of abstract, unrelated levels. Doom, by contrast, did have levels that were supposed to take place in one overarching setting, but the levels themselves were just completely unrelated, disconnected levels. A full episode of Doom was not one consistent physical space, but instead 8 disjointed physical spaces separated by loading screens that showed a map. Myst, on the other hand, was extensively about navigating a physical space that remains a mostly consistent physical space. In that sense, in Myst, you are on the island, and in Half-Life, you are in Black Mesa. By portraying the various chapters of the game as one coherent game space, Black Mesa stops being just an abstraction to hang gameplay on, but a setting and a character in its own right. Up until the point of no return, Half-Life is essentially an adventure game first. During the early portions of the game, the player is given a first-person shooter control scheme but with a more adventure-like pacing and emphasis. This isn't to say that Half-Life is intending to be an adventure game much at all, it really isn't. Rather, the game pulls cues from adventure games and from RPGs in order to help construct a more immersive first-person shooter experience. This is, of course, by 1998 standards, and the game is still a game after all, so the effects of NPC interaction haven't quite hit their stride in the first Half-Life, which I think the series improved on much more in the sequel. Still, I think that the NPC's canned responses have some charm to them.
Hey, catch me later, I'll buy you a beer. Can we do this later? Sorry, I'm on duty, Mr. Freeman. Sorry, sir, I've got to stay at my post. Sorry, sir, I've got to stay at my post. Sorry, I'm on duty, Mr. Freeman. Hey, catch me later, I'll buy you a beer.
That said, the setting of Black Mesa still feels particularly inspired even compared to games from today. Indeed, Black Mesa really does feel like a vital piece to the game, something that always takes some degree of importance even when the player is focused on mowing down aliens. The actual Resonance Cascade moment is still pretty tense after all these years, and a major part of that is the build-up. When you enter into the giant room, there's this ominous feeling to it. The giant, almost cave-like structure of the room, with this odd device in the middle, I think gives the player the idea that something is very wrong in here. The rest of Black Mesa has been relatively homely, with the real sense that this is just another day in the office. But once you enter the test chamber, it gives a very strong implication that something very big is happening in Black Mesa, or even something big is going to happen. Adding to the tension caused by the architecture, the lack of a weapon, which initially set up a sort of sense of safety, then betrays that sense of safety once the Resonance Cascade actually happens. It's interesting, the game is almost speaking the language of adventure games up until the Cataclysm, when it suddenly thrusts you into an action game without a weapon. Being able to switch tones so dramatically and disempowering the player in the process, I think is the main reason why the opening of the game is still so intense to play. Of course, then we are finally given a weapon, and this is where we get to yet another iconic moment in the series, the crowbar. The crowbar has become possibly the definitive melee weapon in all of gaming, or at the very least in first-person shooters. Melee weapons existed before, of course, with the axe from Quake being a prime example, but they served little purpose other than to give the player some means of attack when they're otherwise running out of ammo. Here, the melee weapon is not just the default weapon for people who run out of ammo, almost always stuck in a state of uselessness. Instead, the crowbar is one of the most inspired design choices for a first-person shooter. Let me explain why. First of all, in terms of the drama of the game, being given a melee weapon as your first option against the aliens is a good way to really make the player feel disempowered and like they're part of a bigger picture that isn't looking too kind to Gordon Freeman. It's also a handy way of establishing the necessity of the crowbar in the gameplay of Half-Life. Given that the FPS genre has a history of making melee weapons useless, forcing the player to start with only a crowbar and then forcing the player to immediately use it on a glass panel in order to escape sets up for the player a sort of unseen tutorial on how to apply the crowbar, as a means of breaking things open. This isn't exactly the best metric for the value of a design decision in a game, but we're gonna go with it. Theoretically, at least for this video, the value of a given entity in a game, be it an object, a weapon, or something else, should be determined by how many uses you can get out of one thing. If, for example, an item serves 0 functions in the game, then it is completely useless and has no real design value. If an item can serve 1 function, that would be better, and 2 functions better than 1, and so on. That's a bit simplistic, but when it comes to weapons in games, this standard can demonstrate why the crowbar is so important. Ideally, a programmer would want to use all of the weapons available to you at some point, which is why a lot of better shooter games tend to have each weapon serve a different purpose. A machine gun has completely different value to the player than a shotgun, so they aren't interchangeable and thus redundant. If you want to save game space, it's best to have as little redundant features as possible. What happens when the default weapon a player begins with is a pistol, like in Doom, or a shotgun, like in Quake, with the other default weapon being a melee weapon, is that the melee weapon's main function is being a last resort weapon to use in case you run out of ammo for every other weapon, with a minor function being a means of conserving ammo. This means that throughout the course of those games, those weapons see very little use at all. By contrast, in Half-Life, the crowbar is employed frequently throughout the game. This is because it serves multiple functions. It can be used as a last resort weapon, of course, but it also is used to break open crates, which helps you uncover items, helps you break through glass in order to be able to reach blocked off areas, it allows you to conserve ammo while doing these things, and also, as far as I can tell, allows you to kill enemies without alerting other enemies to your presence. Breaking open crates on its own adds a lot of value to the game over previous mainstream shooters. In Quake, there were boxes you could jump on top of, but you couldn't break them. Allowing them to be breakable and hiding items inside of them means that Half-Life not only increases the amount of functions for the melee weapon over Quake, but also increases the amount of functions for the crates over Quake. This is such a minor detail, but it turns what is essentially just a block into something with a lot more possibilities for a designer. It also adds to the game feel, and that a block that is unbreakable and unmovable like the ones in Quake feel just like a brick, like a piece of geometry glued onto a map. By contrast, the boxes in Half-Life feel like, well, actual boxes. Being able to smash them open is not only repeatedly satisfying, but also helps make the game feel a little bit more realistic and less abstract. So not only do the crates serve a gameplay function, but they also serve an aesthetic function that changes the way it feels to play a game in just a subtle enough way that people won't really notice it, but it will still feel the effects in action. So in a sense, the crowbar sort of helped transform the shooter genre into feeling less like an abstract rendering of geometry and programming, and instead feel a bit more like an actual world that the player occupies. Windows that can be broken open are essentially just doors, a temporary physical lock on your ability to enter into a new area. But the game feel of smashing it open with a crowbar turns what was just a door with a new coat of paint into something that feels a bit more real. It's these tiny changes in realism and design that allow us to have such immersive modern experiences. We have to keep in mind that programmers have to construct a new reality from the ground up, and so each step in the timeline of gaming includes with it a new programming idea that needs to be executed in order to create things in gaming that we would normally take for granted in real life. Breaking a window in real life is very simple mechanically, and I'm sure it's not all that difficult to program, but it still needed to be done, and I think the crowbar kills a lot more than 2 birds with 1 stone when it comes to how it influences the design and the experience of the game. Jumping ahead a little bit, I want to talk about the head crabs and the head crab zombies. The game is sort of a blending of a few different genres into the first person shooter experience. From other games, it borrows from the adventure genre just a little bit, and from movies and games, it borrows from sci fi, action, and horror genres in order to bring with it a cinematic sense of thrill and tension. Zombies have been a cliche of film for a long time, and by 1998 they had definitely been explored in the realm of games. That said, the head crabs and the head crab zombies are a great way of reinterpreting a cliche to make it feel very fresh. There's something utterly creepy about a giant parasite that turns you into a mindless zombie just by jumping on your head, and makes an otherwise almost kind of cute little animal come across as terrifying, at least in the world of the game. Zombies have a lot of mechanical value as a monster in gaming, because they're often slow moving and use melee attacks. The tension comes from their numbers and their placement. If you have enough zombies, or if you place them in the right spot, they can really ramp up the tension of the game for the player. But because they're so cliche, just having generic zombies in a game becomes almost campy, so the decision to have head crabs turn people into zombies allows for the zombies to look more otherworldly and frightening, makes them come across as not necessarily zombies in a traditional sense of the word, and allow the creators to utilize the mechanical values of zombies without disrupting the immersion of the experience by portraying them in a cliche manner. It's also worth noting that the head crabs help the realism of the game in another way. Jumping off of a game like Quake as an example, most monsters in the game are the same height as you or taller, with the only monster coming to mind that's smaller is the attack dogs. This is fine in an old school arcade sensibility, where the monsters are just monsters, but when trying to create an immersive experience, having just about every enemy at the same height as you means that the vertical space of the game will be de-emphasized for the player, which I think takes away from the ability to see the environment as an actual environment. By contrast, having tiny creatures on the floor that will jump up at you forces you to pay more attention to all three dimensions of the environment, rather than just what you see in front of and behind you. Interestingly enough, how enemies are designed in games not only affects the interaction between enemy and player, but between player and environment. And I think the head crabs add just that much more of a comprehensive first-person experience because it changes the way that the player is likely to interact with the environment, thus causing the environment to be more directly relevant to the player's attention, which I think helps facilitate immersion. It's expected then that first-person shooters would adopt a head crab-like creature in future games, including Doom 3 and Halo. Alright, so let's finally talk about the level design. The level design of the original Half-Life set out to accomplish a few things. One is to make it feel as though the game space is, at the very least, a simulation of a real place. Two is to make the flow of the game feel seamless by making it feel like one continuous level split into chapters, rather than a series of unrelated physical spaces. And three is to disguise the more game-like aspects of the design through finding some sort of plausible way that abstract level geometry can be portrayed in a way that doesn't come across as abstract. Doom, by contrast, was more playful with its level design, designing one level in particular to look like a hand when you open up the map. This sort of playfulness can be fun, but it doesn't serve a point of realism, and Half-Life's end goal seems to be providing a fun shooter experience through realism rather than in spite of it. It's a balance, though, because Half-Life still does have some degree of arcade sensibility in the way that the levels are constructed. For example, in the chapter Blast Pit, you have to avoid these giant worm monsters that will kill you instantly if they hit you. The scene is portrayed as taking place in a rocket testing room, and so as a player, looking at it while mid-game, it seems to make sense. You have to climb down the ladders to make it in and out of the room. However, for seemingly no logical reason, the ladders are placed on opposite ends of the room. In terms of actual realistic architecture, it would make sense to place the ladders pretty close to one another so that you can get up and down the room faster without having to walk to the other side of the room and waste both time and energy. Of course, these ladders are placed on opposite sides for the sake of gameplay, rather than realism. While the game does have a facade of realism, it uses realism to mask the more game-oriented elements. These ladders are really placed at opposite ends in order to make the level more exciting and force the player to confront the giant worms for a lengthier period of time, thus increasing the tension of being stuck in that room with them. As such, the game has a back and forth in its level design between realism and classic game-oriented fun. When the designers want the player to feel more tension or want the player to have quiet time or want the player to be excited, the level design will shape itself to match this. Because the setting is portrayed as one coherent place, the level design feels like it's natural, and so it goes unnoticed when the designer is actually manipulating both the psychology and reaction of the player. This is what characterizes the modern game most, that they can design the reaction that the player is supposed to have by masking it into the design, rather than bringing the intended result to the forefront. Looking at vents, for example, vents are a fairly frequent feature of the maps in Half-Life. From a player standpoint, a vent is just a piece of the Black Mesa facility. But from a programmer standpoint, a vent allows for a feeling of claustrophobia and defenselessness because it gives the player limited mobility, and it also functions as a form of quiet time for the player, which means that, depending on the situation, it can be used both to increase and decrease the tension, and on top of that, helps the pacing by breaking up the potential monotony of the gameplay and helping to create a peaks and valleys structure to the game that allows the more exciting moments to shine by contrast. My favorite moment in the entire game takes place in what is basically a vent. It's this moment in Surface Tension, where the vents turn you into a prairie dog, fighting against soldiers on the ground. What I love about this moment is that the time in the vents serves as a safety net from being attacked, but the soldiers can also throw grenades down the vents, which means that you're only safe so long as you stay well away from whatever spot they're focusing on. As such, this allows the player to strategize a way of taking out all of the enemies, which is especially fun when you have low health. While it seems like such a basic setup, this kind of gameplay didn't really exist much before 1998. This moment almost feels like it could fit well into a stealth game, but rather than giving the player the feeling that they've at any point crossed genres, it uses level design to quite literally funnel player psychology into a more stealth game mindset, without necessarily realizing that this was the intention of the game. Of course, one area where the light genre bending of the game hasn't necessarily aged as well is the platforming. Full disclosure, I actually like the platforming in Half-Life, and I think that even by most people's standards, I'd still say that it's an admirable failure, if others do consider it a failure. I can see why people don't like the platforming, and I think it's actually because of the way that movement is handled while on the ground. Simply put, being able to land in one spot without having to fidget in 3 different directions to avoid sliding off means that you're going to end up inadvertently sliding off of ledges a lot. The way in which the player lands after making a difficult jump is very awkward and hard to manage successfully, and I would call this a minor flaw of the game. That said, I still think it's an admirable idea to incorporate platforming because it expands the scope of the game to also incorporate influences from platformers. Again, the game sort of combined different elements from genres and blended them into one unique experience. What this means is that the gameplay is extensively a first-person shooter, with first-person controls and so on. Additionally, the game throws elements from other genres in, like RPGs, stealth games, adventure games, and of course, platformers, but does all of these while still keeping an FPS control scheme. It's this universally consistent control scheme that helps make these different genre inspirations feel seamless and like part of the same package. However, it's the flaws in this control scheme that makes the platforming in particular stick out like a sore thumb as clearly borrowing and failing to borrow from a different genre. Indeed, first-person platforming really hasn't caught on much after Half-Life's release, and this is because, unlike the other genre influences that Half-Life pulls from, this flaw in the control scheme makes first-person platforming feel like too obvious of an old-school influence. While Half-Life pulls from other old-school genres, it uses realism and consistency to make these genres feel like a modern experience, whereas the lack of realism and lack of solid controls for the platforming bits causes these bits to feel dated, which I think is a shame because I think first-person platforming does have potential, as exercised by multiplayer maps in Half-Life and Team Fortress Classic. Now let's talk about a term that has become pretty commonplace in gaming in the past 10 years or so: cover-based shooter. A lot of complaints lobbed at modern shooters is that they're cover-based, and I've started to find this term a bit strange, because playing through Half-Life I noticed that the cover is actually a very important part of the game. This isn't something that started in Half-Life either. Thinking back to Doom 2, cover played an important role when up against the Arch Vile, whose attacks could hit you no matter where you were unless you found cover. Half-Life also emphasizes cover in such a way with the soldiers and the Vortigaunts. The Vortigaunts can hit you no matter where you are as long as you don't find cover, so the enemy's attacks encourage you to balance between killing them or finding cover before the attack fully charges. So the game does want you to find cover at least temporarily. The main difference, I think, between the decried cover-based shooters that have become increasingly prevalent and a game like Half-Life is how it strikes a balance. This is another aspect of Half-Life's level design. The game isn't extensively, repeatedly, endlessly about finding cover to hide behind. Instead, it has corridors, it has open spaces, it has vents, it has platforming, and it has cover. The way that cover-based segments of games go is usually there's a big open area with knee-high walls that the player will know to hide behind. This has become such a common trope of level design that it started to bother players. But I think the reason why this bothers players is because after a while it becomes too obvious through its repetition. What makes Half-Life work is that it doesn't rely on this concept, but I feel like having no cover-based combat at all would also reduce the game to a different form of monotony, where strategy doesn't necessarily change when facing new enemies. With the balance it strikes now, it manages to not dip too far away from the illusion of realism that it casts, but it also manages to avoid stagnation. The approach to the weaponry of the original Half-Life is definitively old school in approach. Whereas modern games emphasize the realism to a degree that players are often limited to a max of 2 weapons, Half-Life instead has a full arsenal that can be available to the player at any given time. This is more a result of circumstance than anything. The arbitrary limitation of a maximum gun amount to 2 is not necessarily the most realistic possible. People have the capacity to hold more weapons on their body than just 2. The reason why games did this was to sort of mask a limitation through an appeal to a more realistic approach. Halo, arguably the first game to popularize the 2-weapon model, was one of the first shooters designed deliberately to be a console game, from the ground up. Of course, previous games like GoldenEye do exist, but those games often had the problem of having to cycle through multiple guns in order to find the gun you want. Limiting the guns to only 2 was an easy way to allow the player the option of switching weapons to the weapon they want to be using, without having to cycle through and waste time between opening fire. While this might seem like a minor complaint, it can get pretty bad when you're looking for a specific gun in your inventory, and you have to press one button repeatedly in order to find the weapon, only to accidentally scroll past it. I've played a game, for example, where you had to use one button to cycle through well over 15 weapons. The inconvenience adds up, so limited arsenal is more practical in this case. 2 is just the number games went with in order to make switching between weapons as easy as possible. Half-Life came before the shift towards console shooters, and as a result, the weapon balance functions much differently from a lot of modern shooters, and I think it's for the best, because I think the 2-weapon system, while valuable in a game like Halo, would fit poorly into the higher speed of gameplay like Half-Life. I also just think it's a lot more fun to be able to play around with different weapons and their abilities. As I said before, the crowbar is very useful throughout the game, but how do the other weapons fare? I think there are some definite strong weapons and definite weaker ones, in terms of weapon balance. The Magnum, for example, is a weapon I found myself relying on a lot, because it's just so damn powerful and accurate. There's pretty much no enemy in the game that the Magnum won't be useful against, except for the head crabs where it would mostly be a waste of ammo on them. Similarly, the secondary fire for the machine gun means that if you have the ammo on hand, you can clear out whole rooms like nothing. By contrast, the Hive Hand, the weapon that the alien grunts drop, was only barely used at all throughout my most recent playthrough and only out of obligation. It's not useless exactly, just not very practical and very redundant. One benefit is that it never runs out of ammo, but apart from that, it's basically reduced to only ever being a last resort weapon, rather than something that has much value on its own. As far as I'm concerned, the best way to achieve weapon balance is to make every weapon serve some sort of functional or tactical use that is exclusive to that weapon. The crowbar, for example, is the only melee weapon, so it's not made redundant by the inclusion of another melee weapon. The trip mine, as another example, isn't something I ever found myself using, but it's still a positive in terms of weapon balance because it has a unique strategical quality to it. You can use it to set up traps for incoming enemies. I tried this at one point and basically failed, but it's still a useful weapon. Every weapon in the game I feel is unique enough in terms of usage and strategy, with the standout weapons being the Magnum, shotgun, rocket launcher, Gauss cannon, glue-on gun, and the crossbow. Again, the one exception is the hive hand, which is mostly just kind of there and never sees much use. But weapon balance is a combination of two things: usefulness and necessity. If every gun is useful, then that's good. But if every gun is also of critical importance, then that's the most balanced a weapon set can get. And in that sense, the interchangeability of a lot of the weapons in Half-Life means that the actual amount of weapons in the game could be cut down while maintaining or even improving the weapon balance. It's worth noting, though, that most balance is not the same as best. I don't think any guns apart from the hive hand are actually redundant. They're just not, in and of themselves, given a particularly necessary function. The crowbar is, at times, actually necessary, but you could play the whole game without using the magnum, and you wouldn't be at a strategic disadvantage. It's just, having the option to use the magnum, in my opinion, is better than not having it, because the way each gun feels means that different players with different approaches and different preferences will gravitate towards different weapons that they prioritize. I prioritize the magnum, but someone else might prioritize the submachine gun instead. So I think the best option is to facilitate player creativity and freedom while cutting down on redundant weapons until you have a set of weapons where each one has some sort of function unique to itself. Of course, part of how weapon balance operates in a game is dependent on how enemies are handled as well, and that's one area where Halo improved on Half-Life. The reason why the weapon set is largely interchangeable in Half-Life is because the game surrounding the weapons doesn't pressure the player to prioritize any particular gun over another. Sometimes it does. While underwater, you literally can't use some of your guns, forcing you to use the pistol or the crowbar. While on a vent, you're likely going to want to switch to your pistol or crowbar to conserve ammo, while still worrying about headcrabs. By contrast, in Halo, they went about making the weapons more important in a different way. Simply put, the Covenant's weaponry doesn't work very well against the Flood, but works very well against the Covenant, so you're going to prioritize different sets of weapons depending on what enemies you're facing. In a mostly Flood-oriented section of the game, you're going to want to stick with the pistol, shotgun, or assault rifle, while in a mostly Covenant section of the game, it's useful to carry a plasma pistol or plasma rifle with you. That's one of the major missed opportunities in Half-Life, is that, despite fighting multiple factions of enemies, no particular weapon is incentivized by the varying enemies apart from a basic rule of weaker enemies, weaker guns. Fighting the soldiers versus the alien slaves, for example, might very well change how you approach movement and usage of cover in the combat, but which guns you use is probably going to remain less relevant to the outcome of any given firefight. Despite this, the enemies of Half-Life are one of the best pieces of the experience in general. I've already talked about the headcrabs and the zombies, but I want to highlight how well executed the enemies are. Genuinely, it feels like every single enemy changes the player's approach to the game in some way. The Vortigaunts encourage you to find cover as soon as possible, while the Assassins might cause you to automatically switch to explosives because they simply move too damn fast to get a good hit on them. The Houndeyes need to be killed quickly, while the Barnacles can simply be left alone as long as you don't touch them. No enemy feels absolutely pointless, and each one feels like it changes the way I'm likely to interact with the game at any given moment. Of course, I don't think we could talk about the enemies without talking about the soldiers. The soldiers are renowned for their AI, and this is another example where the midway point between the old school and the new is fascinating. The soldiers' AI was, for a lot of people, seen as a push towards realism, and I agree. They definitely act more like soldiers than any previous game enemies would. I've seen them compared to the later game Fear as another example of good AI in games, and I honestly think that the soldiers here are better AI than the ones in Fear. Maybe not on a technical level, but in practice. The soldiers here, despite being a push towards realism, have a very game-like feel to them, in the sense that how they act can totally change how you will approach the game. By contrast, the enemies in Fear, I felt like, despite their AI being advanced, you could just mow through them no problem because there wasn't anything particular about them that felt clever in practice. Meanwhile, harkening back to that moment in surface tension from earlier, the soldiers know immediately to throw explosives into the hole that you're in order to force you out. This is not only more realistic, but also just more fun, because it forces the player to re-strategize whenever they think they can use cover to maintain the upper hand. When you're pinned up against a group of these guys, it is emphatically not a typical shooter experience. Instead, their AI totally reshape how the player will think and act in their presence. And this makes for some of the most interesting and fun moments in the entire game, the entire series even. Now, I've gone on long enough, but I want to do one last thing before I wrap up, and this will run a bit long, but I want to go chapter by chapter, from unforeseen consequences onward, talking briefly about my feelings towards the chapters and how the game manages to maintain a consistently strong pace throughout the entire game. Unforeseen Consequences is easily one of the worst chapters in the game in terms of gameplay, but it gets the ball rolling heavily in terms of presentation and cinematic quality. If I were to discuss the most fun moments of the game, it wouldn't be this chapter. But if I were to discuss the most iconic, Unforeseen Consequences is the reigning champion of giving the player an experience that'll stick in their mind. Other than that, it's mostly just acquainting the player with the game, sort of a quick set of mini tutorials to get the player used to how the game will play out. Office Complex is, in my opinion, one of the more fun chapters of the game, because the gameplay finally starts to settle in and the game picks up steam. I'm not a particularly big fan of the freezer section, but some of the set pieces, like the encounters with the Vortigons and a zombie ripping its way through a wall while another falls out of a window, I think are a great time. We've Got Hostiles is up near the top of favorite moments in the game for me, because it's the first chance for us to get acquainted with the turrets and with the soldiers. We've Got Hostiles is sort of a mix of the set-piece action of Unforeseen Consequences with the more gameplay focus of Office Complex. So up until this point, it's sort of the definitive part of the experience so far. I especially like crawling through the vents over soldiers who aren't aware that you're there. There's a tension but also a playfulness to this, where my first instinct is to find a way to kill them before they catch on that I'm even in the area. Again, this is a moment where the game sort of subconsciously encourages stealth rather than making it mandatory. Blast Pit is where things start to weaken in terms of gameplay, and Blast Pit functions basically as an elongated puzzle. It's very similar to an adventure game, where in order to progress, you need to activate some things elsewhere that allow you to activate something in the main hub area that allows you to move forward. It's a very easy trick to use in order to encourage the player towards an objective, but it's not particularly fun in practice. The game tries to disguise it as a boss battle when it's really just a very basic press a few buttons in different areas to move forward kind of adventure game premise. Power Up isn't particularly weak or strong, it's more just standard, but it has one particular moment that I really love, which is when you first come down this elevator only to be met by trip mines. That brief moment with the Hound Eye coming your way is one of the highlights of the game for me, and I can't really explain why. It's just one of those little touches that makes the experience feel more whole in such a small way. On a Rail is probably my least favorite chapter in the entire game, mostly because it relies heavily on the gimmick of riding on a tram throughout the entire chapter. The encounters in this section are fun and the exploration is decent, but reducing you to this small square of space and just standing still as things pass by isn't particularly interesting to me. Apprehension sort of continues along the path of Unforeseen Consequences, in that it's more of a set-piece oriented section rather than a gameplay section. The set pieces pay off fairly well, I think, but other than that, it's fairly standard. The ending of the chapter, where you get captured and then have to escape from out of a trash compactor, is one of the highlights of the game. Residue processing I always saw as sort of a midway point. In terms of story structure, it very much feels like it, where being captured causes Gordon to lose all of his weapons, and the next section of the game is very platforming based and not a lot of combat. This really works well to sell the idea that this is the low point of the game, and I actually think the platforming in this section is a lot of fun, compared to other sections where it can get a little obnoxious. It's the ultimate quiet time section of the game because of the shifted focus away from combat, and is another highlight of the game for me. Questionable Ethics is not necessarily one of my favorite sections of the game, but it is interesting from a world-building perspective. The way in which Half-Life's plot unfolds is mostly that your sense of what's going on is limited down to get from point A to point B. We know Black Mesa is falling apart, and early on we see an experiment supposedly go wrong, but Questionable Ethics is the moment where the player really gets a sense of the world of Black Mesa and what's going on. These creatures have not just entered into our world, they've already been here. We've been running tests on them. The chapter almost feels like an animal testing lab, and the name Questionable Ethics applies to this sort of science-first, life-second approach where the headcrabs and bull squids are made out to be test subjects, creatures of curiosity as opposed to value. Most importantly, the chapter kind of implies that Black Mesa brought this on themselves. This isn't an accident that came out of nowhere. This was a case of hubris turned catastrophe, or even worse, intention. You get the feeling while playing this section that maybe the resonance cascade wasn't such an accident after all. Despite Half-Life's tendency towards the dramatic pacing of an action film, there is some subtle sort of information being presented here, and I love how Half-Life as a series, and Valve games in general, have managed to always feel like we're on the cusp of some important discovery, while never quite being given enough information to know what's happening, while still having enough info to piece together what we think might be happening. Surface Tension is probably my favorite chapter in the entire game, because this is where the action movie sensibilities are turned up past 100. The chase with the helicopter is one of the better moments of action in the game, and the scene I mentioned earlier that turns the player into a temporary prairie dog is a highlight. I also love the cliffside scene, which is another section that requires a bit of strategy, especially when you're like me and you end up running low on health right around the save point. Of course, this scene is also charmingly simplistic graphically, with the skybox being so visible that it becomes obvious that you're looking at a pre-rendered map rather than an actual place. For the time, this was realism. Now, it's more cute than anything. There's also one section where trip mines will absolutely kill you if you explode a single one, and this moment is another personal favorite of mine in the game, because it's so different and manages to make the simple act of a head crab moving slowly towards you in a really tense moment. Forget About Freeman is another low point in the game, mostly because there's really not much of consequence in the chapter. It's pretty straightforward and relatively quiet, a sort of buffer zone between Surface Tension and the rest of the third act of the game. It does do a fairly decent job of really helping the player feel like Black Mesa is falling apart, and in that sense, it reminds me a bit of Unforeseen Consequences, more focused on the feeling rather than the gameplay. L'Homme Decor is another highlight of the game. It's not as action-intense as Surface Tension, but it's one of the sections that relies most heavily on platform and basic puzzles. It does create this feeling that we're getting into the belly of the beast, so to speak, and this is where the picture of Black Mesa becomes mostly complete. We understand now that there is teleportation technology, and can infer from here that humans may have traveled to Zen first. I especially enjoy the teleporter room that sort of combines platforming with a basic puzzle. It's one of those moments of quiet time that really helps complete the experience of the game, though I could imagine this section being annoying for some players. The ending set piece with running into the teleporter is really fun too. Alright, time to talk about Zen. I know people hate this section of the game, but I want to make a case for it. I think it's one of the highlights of the game, and here's why. Up until this moment, the game has had a peaks and valleys approach to pacing, where we'll get something very high-octane like Surface Tension, followed by something quieter and slower like Forget About Freeman. This up and down pacing allows for the game to never feel like it's running out of energy, but always in a state of building over the course of the game. Building to Zen, I think, was a disappointment for a lot of people because Zen is so different mechanically that it doesn't work for them. I think they were expecting a climax more akin to Surface Tension or We've Got Hostiles. Something that really feels like a climax in the traditional action movie sense of the word. Instead, we get a gaming equivalent to an ending more like 2001: A Space Odyssey. Definitely not as surreal, but still just as much of a curveball to the audience. This, I think, actually is why the ending works so well. It throws the player out of their normal zone of play into something else. It is, instead of being exciting, more of a contemplative exercise. It's a set piece in a different, more science fiction sense of the word, and less action-y. Experiencing the world of Zen, the strange ecosystem, the quiet hollowness of it all, I think sells the idea that we're in a place that's truly alien. I love that about the section, but there's also more to it than just that. See, I mentioned questionable ethics earlier and how it hinted that something deeper than what we were experiencing firsthand was going on. Zen kind of does the same thing, and is a tremendous piece of somewhat tragic irony and world building. See, we find dead bodies of fellow hazard-suited men scattered along Zen, implying that, indeed, humans have been here, and we're probably here first. The game flips itself on its head. You were once the victim of an invasion from an alien species, and you find yourself, instead, the invader. You are now invading on their home, and the drop-in action film pacing, I think, is meant to be sort of a twist. Zen is, all things considered, a very peaceful place. You're not on the defensive side of things anymore. You're the offender. You're the intruder, or rather, we are as humans. If you feel like the level design of the section just doesn't work, I feel like this was a tonal and thematic point being hammered home. The strange approach to design reflects a strange world, which I think, for me, at least generates a bit of sympathy for the creatures of Zen. Earth is normal to us, but to them it would be strange and foreign, much the same way that the level design to Zen it feels like a left turn to us. I think the main flaw of Zen, for most, is that they traded the action film ending for the sci-fi film ending, and this disrupts the pacing of the game and for a lot of people just isn't very fun. To me, that change in pacing I think makes the ending feel a lot more climactic than it would otherwise. I don't think the best approach to building up to a climax is to do the same thing that we've been doing throughout the entire game. An entire 3 chapters of quiet time really sells the idea that we're in a different place. And to me, the best strength of Half-Life as a series is the way in which the world of the game reveals the story in small ways. Zen is a moment where learning is a bit more important than shooting, and that doesn't sound like a particularly fun idea for a game, but I don't think I'd have it any other way, because it traded one of Half-Life's strengths for another, but it went with one that most people aren't going to be paying attention to while playing. For those who don't like Zen, I say, try to see it with fresh eyes. Focus on what Zen is tonally, thematically, and in terms of story, rather than what it is in terms of the flow of the game. The flow is disrupted intentionally, because if anything, this climax is not one of heroism, but one of villainy. The game even ends with the implication that there are bigger, less benevolent forces above you who want you to do the wrong thing, and by the end, you've succeeded at just that. I won't talk in depth about the individual parts of the Zen chapters, except to say that the Gonarch I think is a compelling yet simplistic boss. The idea that the headcrabs have a mother, and that this mother is nothing more than just a creature, I think helps sell home the point that you're the intruder. This is the headcrab's home, and you go and destroy it. The boss is a bit buggy, and I had a lot of frustrations with that, but the experience of seeing the origin of the headcrabs is one that I think helps sell the tone of Zen as a peaceful place being intruded. It's almost kind of sad watching the Gonarch die, to be honest. The final boss, the Nolanth, gets a lot of flack for being overly convoluted. I know a strategy to kill it without having to go through the convoluted process of being teleported away to different areas, but I really like this boss, because after all that we've been through, it's surprisingly more of a quiet moment than anything. And while the boss is huge, the fight really feels like the Nolanth is acting more out of self-defense and you are the one being the attacker. It's sort of downbeat and less a climax of game than it is a climax of tone. All in all, Half-Life is a very fantastic game, and one that I think a lot of developers and players can learn from. A lot of what Half-Life set out to do helped set a precedent for modern gaming, and we see that thread run through first-person and third-person shooter games in more recent years. That said, Half-Life still clings on to a few older traditions, but combines them in a way that sort of disguises them by weaving them into a more realistic, universalized approach. The game can pull elements from stealth, platformers, adventure games, RPGs, and so on, while always feeling like a first-person shooter first and foremost. The game is an exercise in tone revealed throughout the world of the game rather than through the plot, with the plot more akin to a standard action film, but the tone more like that of a contemplative science fiction work. It understands that even when making a simplistic game focused on gameplay, that there is a way to tell story through that without sacrificing said simplicity. I think they would expand on this further in Half-Life 2 and a hell of a lot more in Portal, but the environment of Black Mesa becomes a character of its own that reveals details about the experience in passing and quietly, while still allowing the action to keep a loud priority in the experience. Some things haven't aged well. The platforming, for example, was seen as a mistake by a lot, whereas I see it as more of a missed opportunity. If games could have refined first-person platforming, it could have been woven into the game better to help disguise it as more authentically immersive and realistic, whereas here it sticks out like a sore thumb as a sort of attempt to gamify these settings in a cheap way. This isn't because first-person platforming is inherently bad, but because Half-Life's control scheme and obvious dichotomy between combat moments and platforming moments causes the platforming to feel dated because the concept of first-person platforming never truly caught on. Meanwhile, I think what the game gets best is pushing the player always forward without ever feeling redundant or stale, and it does this through a combination of peaks and valleys pacing, weapon balance, enemy encounters, and occasionally cross-referencing other genres. It's how these mixture of genres become incorporated into the basic framework of a first-person shooter that we see the construction of what I would be willing to call the first modern game. As such, I think that the main lesson that more recent games can learn from Half-Life is how liberally the game pulls from older works, while interpreting it through a first-person shooter lens. In this case, it's specifically that Half-Life pulls from out of genre, thus not risking becoming redundant. If Half-Life's only influence is Quake, it would just feel like Quake, and it wouldn't lead anywhere. Half-Life never quite bends genre, but instead uses the consistent first-person shooter control scheme in order to mask the light influences from other genres that it pulls from. Another, more recent example of a game that crosses genres while masking them into the main experience would be The Chronicles of Riddick: Escape from Butcher Bay, a game I may do a review of at some point. Being able to weave other genres' ideas into the main genre of your game does a good job of making the game feel like its own experience rather than being derivative. Of course, Half-Life is very derivative in a lot of ways, but its legacy is in how it derived and what it derived, and how these things blend together. Modern gaming, I feel, often built off of Half-Life as a foundation, but some could stand to learn from why Half-Life makes such a sturdy foundation to begin with. Alright, well, I think I've talked enough about Half-Life. I don't know if I might ever do this kind of analysis for Half-Life 2, but if people want that, I may add it to my list at some point in the future. I definitely think I'll take a look at Portal sometime in the future, but for now, I just have to say that Half-Life is a fantastic game, and one of my favorite games of all time. Definitely worth playing for yourself. I have a Patreon now, and I'm trying to find a way to turn this channel into a source of revenue so I can help pay for college. So if you want to support me in any way, you're free to donate there, though you really don't have to feel any obligation to. I also have a Twitter, @Malmrose Project, if you want to follow me there. I post a lot more often there, and it's usually a bunch of nonsense. Both of these things are in the description, and as always, I look forward to seeing you in the comments.